Hey everyone, how you doing? Just wanted to do a quick video lecture here on homeostasis in fish. So let's begin. We're going to talk about temperature regulation a little bit, ion regulation a little bit, and the stress response a little bit. So first off, let's talk about what is homeostasis. Homeostasis is maintaining an internal equilibrium, or keeping a constant environment within the body. And that's important for your body's chemical reactions. And so if your pH or your temperature fluctuates wildly, it's harder for you to have a constant set of internal reactions. So maintaining an internal equilibrium is good for you in the long run. And so one of the things we're going to talk about is a temperature, maintenance of temperature. Now, we say that most fish are poikilothermic, which means that they don't maintain the same temperature. Their temperature can vary, all right? But what if you have somewhere where the environment is relatively constant, like the tropics, where the water temperature doesn't vary much at all? Then the fish's temperature doesn't vary much at all. And a more appropriate term here is ectothermic, which means they get their heat from outside their body, versus endothermic, which is when you produce your own heat. And often ectothermy and poikilothermy are used interchangeably. They're not exactly the same thing. Poikilothermic means the body's temperature can vary. The opposite of that would be homeothermic, which is a constant body temperature. And then ectothermic and endothermic talk about from where you get your heat. Now, in general, poikilotherms are also mostly ectotherms, but not always. Okay, well, most of our fish are poikilotherms and ectotherms. Now, ectothermy is advantageous for a number of reasons. If you're not producing your own heat, then you don't need as much energy from your food just to produce heat, so you have more energy left over for growth and reproduction. You don't need as much food. You have a lower metabolism. The downside is that you're limited to your habitats, that you have to be somewhere where there's enough heat in the environment to warm you up. And so you can't go into colder environments. And you have temperature-dependent reactions, which means when it gets cold, your reactions slow down, and that can be a bad thing. Now, some fish are endothermic and maintain a body temperature that is greater than their surroundings, and they create their own internal body heat. So they're not necessarily homeothermic. Their temperature can change, but they do create some of their own body heat. Now, the example I'm showing you here, of course, is the tuna, which is a famous example. Just recently, there was a paper published in Science, and it talks about the moonfish. And this is an interesting fish that lives in really, really deep water in the ocean. And it is found to also be endothermic. And we're going to talk about some of the adaptations this fish has, which helps to make it endothermic. It's a cool-looking fish, as you can see here. You see those pectoral fins. It flaps them up and down like a bird, and it does that constantly. And that's one of the things it does to help generate heat. Now, the endothermic fish have a different strategy than mammals, okay? In mammals, we spend a huge percentage of our energy just to generate heat. So a lot of the food you eat just goes to creating your internal heat. But fish have a different strategy. You know, if your house is cold, you can either crank up the furnace, which is kind of what mammals do, or you can insulate your house a lot better and put more clothes on, and that's what fish do. They don't spend a lot of energy to create heat. They do become very efficient at retaining the little bit of heat that they do produce. So that's just, in general, that's what the endothermic fish strategy is. And most of the fish that are endothermic are only endothermic in sort of one region. Their swimming muscles are around their eyes or their brain, so some critical component of their body, but the rest of their body tends to be the temperature of their surroundings. Now, that is what makes the moonfish so interesting, is because this is a fish, and it's probably the first one ever discovered in which the entire body stays at an elevated temperature, and that is including the heart. And when you read the paper, they make a big deal about how the heart, stays a little bit warmer, and most other endothermic fish, that's not true. So some of the examples of fish that are endotherms: the tunas and the mackerel sharks. And in general, these are species that tend to keep their swimming muscles warmer than their external environment. Billfish, which are things like the marlin that's shown here, or sailfish, they tend to keep their eyes and their brains warmer. You know, your eyes and your brains are, obviously it's critical that they function, and so they have strategies for keeping them warmer. Of course, the moonfish, I mentioned, the entire body stays elevated relative to its environment, and there's probably others out there. You know, there's 28,000 to 30-some thousand species of fish. Now, if you think about an ectothermic fish, which is most typical bony fish are ectotherm, and they do not keep their body temperature elevated. You've got that single loop circulatory system where blood goes from the gills to the body, then from the body to the heart, gets pumped to the gills again. And it's at the gills where that blood tends to really cool down, because we've talked about the anatomy of the gills, we've talked about the high surface area. This is where the blood comes within a cell wall of the water, and so that's where any heat that is in the blood is going to be rapidly lost. And so then blood runs from the gills down the dorsal aorta, which is a big aorta going down, obviously, the dorsal side of the fish, and that takes it to the core of the fish and takes that cool blood in and keeps the whole body cool. But in the endothermic fish, some of the strategies they have are to redirect that blood away from the core initially. So instead of taking that cool blood and putting it right to the core of the body, they redirect it, and they also relocate that red swimming muscle. So the red swimming muscle goes to the core of the body. And so that red muscle that generates a lot of heat gets pushed further inside so it can warm the inner part of the fish, and also it can be somewhat insulated. And then when you redirect that blood, you use the heat from the swimming muscle to heat up the blood before it's distributed to the rest of the fish. And you do that in a couple of typical ways that we've talked about. Reap mirabilis, so you've got these nets of capillaries that are for exchanging heat this time instead of exchanging gases, and also countercurrent mechanisms. So the hot blood that's leaving the core of the fish's body will run counter to the cool blood and transfer its heat to that cool blood. So these are some of the things that these fish do to try to elevate their body temperature. Again, the moonfish is different. The moonfish is cool because it directly warms the blood at the gills, and it's got adaptations so that cool water, the cool blood, gets heated up right away even before it gets to the rest of the fish. And this helps to keep, they also have a lot of things like, you know, different insulation. There's more insulation, and I mentioned the behavioral aspect of constantly flapping their pectoral fins. So all these things in combination help to keep the body and the heart warm. And this really improves their cardiac output in cold water and really gives them advantage in cold water. And these are some figures that I took from the article, which was published in Science. And here is just a picture they made of the temperature regions that they measured within the fish. And you can see that up there by the brain and the eyes has a really warm spot. So they're also concentrating their heat at the critical brain and eye portion, but the rest of the body's temperature throughout the whole body is elevated. And here they had some temperature sensors on, and they released the fish, and then they were able to measure how deep the fish went, how cold was the water there, but simultaneously what was the internal temperature of the fish. And if you study this, I'm going to go ahead and pull up my pen here. And you can see where they released it. The temperature was like 18. And then the fish, here we've got depth. And I'm going to say that this over here is the axis for depth. And yeah, because it's 0 at the top. So then the fish swam down and kind of swam up and down a little bit, and then it swam down into deeper water. And the blue line, which is also on the same scale as temperature over here, the blue line represents the temperature of the water, which tracks the depth pretty well, which makes sense. If you go down deeper, it gets colder. But the important thing is the red line here. And the red line is the fish's internal temperature, which you can see even though the fish went over many different depths and the water temperature varied quite a bit, that fish's internal temperature stayed pretty steady. And that is neat. Here's a picture that they had of the blood vessels in the gills. And you can see the amazing adaptation they have here. Obviously the blue ones are the veins and the red ones are the arteries that they've treated so you can see them. And you can see how the veins and the arteries are just sort of wrapped around one another in a countercurrent fashion in order to retain that heat. And, you know, this is probably similar to a lot of other gills. But probably, well, now that I think about it, probably not, because the arteries are going to come in from one side and are going to leave from one side, and the veins are going to come in from the other side. And in this way, they kind of come in and they interact with each other before they exchange the gas. At any rate, this is another adaptation of the moonfish to keep its body temperature elevated. And so this is a big deal. It does a lot of things for the fish. If you have an elevated body temperature, of course you swim better and you perform better in cold water. Your other muscles, like your stomach muscles, your digestion, just your metabolism in general just works better in the cold water because you're not a prisoner of temperature. You get better brain function. And there are other, not just keeping the blood warm, but there are actually some fish that have thermogenic organs, which are modified eye muscles. I think this is in the billfish. This is how they keep their eyes and their brain warm. So these are eye muscles that have been modified specifically to become organs that just, you know, muscles that contract that are just for the sole purpose of generating heat in the critical brain region. The bottom line is this gives you more habitat and more potential prey. And so that is the long-term evolutionary advantage here. So when you look at some of the more traditional endothermic fish like the tunas, they have an elevated body temperature and they can dive to deeper water, but they can't stay down there for very long. It's only so efficient, and eventually they have to come up to the warmer water to warm themselves up. But this, again, is an advantage that they found with the moonfish. The moonfish are found in extremely deep, extremely cold water, and they can stay down there. So they sort of have this habitat that they can exploit without much other competition or other predators. So, again, that's presumably the long-term evolutionary advantage. Okay, so that was temperature. Let's talk very briefly about ion regulation, and this occurs mostly at the gills too. All right, let's review osmosis. So if you have more solutes, more things dissolved in the water, is that solution, if you're comparing two solutions, and one has more solutes, is the one with more solutes hyperosmotic or hypoosmotic? I'm going to wait and give you a chance to guess. The correct answer is hyperosmotic. Hyper means more, and so if you have more solutes, you're hyperosmotic. And so then water flows from which to which? Does it flow from a hyperosmotic to a hypoosmotic environment, or does it flow from hypoosmotic to hyperosmotic? It flows from hypoosmotic to hyperosmotic. The water is always going to flow toward where you have more solutes dissolved until the solute concentration is equal. Okay, and that is how water is going to flow, but of course ions, if they can cross the membrane, they're going to diffuse down their concentration gradient. And so the ions are going to diffuse from hyperosmotic to the hypoosmotic environment if they can. And so remember that at a fish's gills, you have exchange of both ions and water. And so water can flow one way and ions can flow the other way, depending upon the relative osmolality of the fish to its environment. So osmoregulation is regulating the internal osmotic environment and trying to keep that at within a relatively narrow range. The opposite of osmoregulation is something called osmoconformation, which is where you say, I'm not going to mess with it. I'm just going to have the same osmolarity as my environment. If my environment changes, I change too, much like a poikilothermic or an ectothermic fish would do. And an example of that is hagfishes. Hagfishes don't really spend any energy to osmoregulate. They just kind of take on the osmolality of their environment. But they don't move to many different environments, and so they basically stay in the same osmolality environment their whole life, and so that's kind of why they can get away with this. But most fish are osmoregulators, and they try to regulate their internal osmotic environment. So if we look at a freshwater teleost, is that going to be hyper or hypoosmotic to its environment? The freshwater fish is saltier than its environment, so it is hyperosmotic to its environment. And so, is it going to gain water or lose water? Is it going to gain ions or lose ions? A freshwater teleost is going to gain water and lose ions. So the freshwater teleost is saltier than its environment, which means the water is going to come in through the gills and always wants to come into the fish. There are more ions inside the fish than outside, so the ions that can cross the membrane are going to want to leave the gills and go into the environment. So these are the two things that a freshwater teleost has to fight and has to spend energy against to try to stop these things from happening, or to deal with these things as they happen. So in a freshwater teleost, you've got a lot of salt leaving the gills and a lot of water coming in through the gills. So consequently, freshwater fish urinate a lot. Anybody that fishes has experienced this. You catch a fish, you pick it up, as you're taking it off the hook, it pees all over you. That's because they pee all the time because they're constantly taking in water. Now, their urine does contain a low concentration of salt, but since they pee so much, this actually becomes another significant way that they lose salt. So not only are they losing salts and ions through their gills, they also end up peeing out a lot of it just because they pee all the time. They also lose salt in their feces too. The salt gets into the feces, and so these are all ways that they're constantly losing ions, and they need to retain some of those ions. And so one way they do this is they have cells in their gills called chloride cells, and these actively take up chlorine and sodium ions. Okay, and so they spend energy to actually go and pump ions into their body. Also, they depend upon their food for a lot of the ions they get. So this is how they replenish those lost ions. Now, a marine teleost is just the opposite, okay? Their environment is saltier than they are. They're living in seawater. And so their chloride cells are actually flipped and work the other way. So the salt is constantly trying to come into the fish. They're spending energy to pump it out. And they're constantly losing water to their environment because their environment is saltier, so they have to drink a lot. All right. Now, if you look at the Elasmobranchs, your sharks and that, they actually are different than the teleosts. They live in seawater, but they are actually hyperosmotic to the seawater. Seawater is a roughly 35 parts per thousand. Your average teleost fish is about 10 to 12 parts per thousand of salt. That's just kind of a rough estimate. Freshwater is less than a half a part per thousand. The sharks have lots of things dissolved in their tissues and in their blood in order to become hyperosmotic to seawater. So there's a lot of urea that they retain. They have this compound called TMAO, triethylmethylene oxide. And this makes them similar to a freshwater teleost in that they're actually hyperosmotic, so they have sort of the same problems. A difference between the Elasmobranchs and the freshwater teleosts is that they have a rectal gland and they use their kidneys to osmoregulate, not their gills so much. So they have a similar problem, but they solve it in a different manner. Coincidentally, just something to mention here, coelacanths also have a rectal gland. But coelacanths are not closely related to sharks. It probably evolved independently. This is something we call convergent evolution. Two different lineages sort of stumble upon the same solution independent of one another. Sometimes these two groups have the same characteristic because they have a recent common ancestor from which they got that characteristic. But in the case of the coelacanths and the sharks, that's not the case. They each sort of evolved it independently. Okay. One other thing about gills, and I've mentioned this before, this is also a really important source of getting rid of your nitrogenous waste. So urine and kidneys probably have some function here, but the gills are really important for getting rid of the nitrogenous waste. And one of the ways to get rid of it is they exchange it for sodium at the gills. So kind of two birds with one bullet. Get rid of the ammonia, take up some of the ions you're losing if you're a freshwater teleost. Okay, last thing I want to talk about briefly is the stress response in fish. And they have something called the generalized stress response. What is stress? And one way to define stress is a reaction to factors that drive your physiological systems outside their normal range. So something that maybe you could say disrupts homeostasis, okay? And that could be a lot of things. In fish, the most common things that are going to stress a fish are poor water quality, predators, pathogens, so if they're sick, or if you handle them, pulling them out of the water and handling them, which would be very similar in their mind to probably a predator. The point here is these are common things that cause a stress response in fish. And no matter what the stressor, the fish tend to always respond in a similar manner. And that's called the generalized stress response. And so a lot of things happen concurrent with the stressor. The heart rate goes up, the respiration rate goes up, they release adrenaline, maybe some other hormones, blood glucose levels go up, and the gills become more permeable. Excuse me. Well, it's pretty obvious what all these things are designed to do. The fish is preparing for fight or flight. So something has stressed this fish out, and it's either going to have to fight with the thing or it's going to have to run from the thing. And all those changes obviously help the fish get ready to fight or run away. So your heart rate goes up, your breathing goes up, your gills become more permeable, you can exchange gases faster, your blood glucose goes up so you can burn more energy faster. Well, does any of that sound familiar? We get stressed, and the same thing happens to us. When we get stressed, your heart rate goes up, I don't know if, I assume your blood glucose goes up, your respiration goes up, you release hormones. It's the same thing, and it's for the same reason. We also have the same fight or flight response whenever we're stressed by something. And that's a good thing in the short term, that evolved in the short term to help organisms deal with these things that are dangerous to them. But in the long term, they can be bad for your survival. And that's why chronic stress and being constantly stressed is bad for your health. And if you can't relax and if you're always stressed, your body is always at this elevated level of response, and that's not good for you in the long term. It was only designed to be for a short-term thing. So, I guess the take-home message is relax. Now, it's the same for fish. And if they are stressed out for a long time, that can be bad for them. But also, if the stress is bad enough in the short term, that can be bad for them. One of the big things that's important to a fish in this response is that increased gill permeability. Now, this is a good thing in the short term if you're stressed, because you can get more oxygen in, you can get more waste out. You get rid of your carbon dioxide, you get rid of, that's a good thing. However, remember that the gills are where we osmoregulate. And so if you're making it easier for oxygen and things to get into the fish, you're also making it easier for water to get into the fish. If you're talking about a freshwater fish, you're making it easier for the ions to diffuse in or out, whichever they want to do. And so those things that you need to regulate to maintain homeostasis, it becomes harder to do that when you're stressed. And like I said, you can have acute stress, which is so bad that it causes tissue damage. If the water floods in so quickly, the cells can swell and burst. You can have such a loss of ionic control that your ions, your electrolytes just drop in the toilet, and things, you can't, your muscles won't contract, or your heart stops beating, things like that. That, if the stress is bad enough, that can happen, and that's called acute, and it can kill the fish quickly. More commonly, when we're dealing with fish as humans, is chronic stress, and that the fish is taken from its environment, put into a tank or something. It's into a stressful condition. It's handled quite a bit, and so this is long-term, and the long-term stress is also bad for the fish's survival. They have to spend more energy to osmoregulate. They have less for growth and reproduction. This is also important if you have poor water quality. And so if the water quality is poor, then the fish is constantly stressed. Then they have to spend more energy for osmoregulation, less for growth. It's bad for their long-term survival. That's another reason why we're concerned about water quality when we talk about fish. Simple solution, if you're handling fish and working with them, is to just add salt to the water. Again, we're talking about freshwater teleosts. But a lot of times you may be keeping a fish in a live well for the tournament. You're keeping the fish because you want to keep them alive and eat them later. Maybe you're buying fish, taking them home and putting them in your fish tank. Maybe you're in aquaculture and you're transporting fish. Whatever the reason, grabbing those fish, pulling them out of the water, putting them in another tank, that's very stressful, and they're going to have a tough time osmoregulating. Simply adding salt, and in fish management we've got the actual concentrations. I forget, it's about 1/3 of fish, so you want to get I think you want to get the salt concentration up to like 3 or 4 parts per thousand, 5 parts per thousand. That can greatly improve the survival of your fish. So there you go. When you do that, the fish becomes less hyperosmotic, so less water comes in, fewer salts go out, and then survival goes up. Okay. Last thing I'm going to tell you about is just a cool story that sort of is related to osmoregulation and homeostasis, and that is using bluegills for homeland security. And this is true. So in San Francisco and other places, they got a pilot study that as far as I know, is still going on, where they use bluegills to monitor the water supply. And so the concern here is that if someone were to do something to the water supply, put something in the water supply, trying to poison a whole city, they would want to be able to detect that. So the bluegills are put into a tank that is exposed to city water before it goes out for distribution. And those fish just kind of do their thing, but they're respiration, heart rate, and activity are automatically monitored. And if there's any change in the water quality, the fish will respond with the generalized stress response. Their behavior will change and their respiration, heart rate will go up, and this will be detected, and that will just indicate that there is something going on with the water supply. And so this is much simpler and probably works a lot better if you try to engineer some sort of a sensor to sense something in the water. You'd have to be able to sense every single possible thing that somebody could put in the water, and it would be expensive and it wouldn't work very well. But the fish integrate all these things, and no matter what it is, if their water quality changes, they show the generalized stress response, and that's an indicator that they might want to check the water and something might be wrong with it. So there you go. The wonderful bluegill helping out with homeland security.